which brought them close to disaster. With the latest of Breakfast News' special reports on the Second World War 50 years on, I'm joined by Major General Julian Thompson. Good morning, Julian.
Morning, Andrew. As 1944 was drawing to a close, Hitler knew he had to attack to survive. He wanted to split the Allies in the West, hoping they'd sue for peace. He could then deal with the Soviets attacking in the East. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, insisted on a strategy of attacking on all fronts, and this left the Allied armies strung out along the German border. Hitler's final gamble was to attack at their weakest spot, the Ardennes, and drive to Antwerp. There he hoped to create a second Dunkirk. This set the scene for the most controversial battle of the Western European campaign and fueled a bitter argument between the Allied leaders. The Ardennes, a quiet corner of eastern Belgium, little has changed in 50 years. As Christmas 1944 approached, it was well away from the main battle being fought by the Allied armies. Many American soldiers were green and found themselves here only a few days after arriving in Europe.
It was the thinking of the family Christmas and the first Christmas away from home for a good many of us. And it was a very sentimental time of the year. And I guess the thoughts of a good many of the soldiers occupying the positions there along the line, they were sort of daydreaming and thinking about home.
Opposite the unsuspecting GIs, the Germans had managed to assemble an army of 250,000 men. Although pressed both in the east and the west, the Germans still managed to field over 2,000 tanks, many of them the latest models. At 0 hour, the German onslaught began on 80 miles of the lightly held American sector.
It was pandemonium. It was like every man for themselves. They were coming in this direction and towards us and to the left of us and what have you. But in back of these tanks were the German infantry. And no way in hell were we going to stop any German Tiger tank with an M1 rifle.
The Green 106th U.S. Infantry Division was soon encircled by German infantry, and 9,000 surrendered. They were not alone. Across the front, other units decided to go west that day as panic spread like wildfire. The Americans here surrendered in greater numbers than at any time since their Civil War.
They would come up to us and spit in our face, and you can feel the saliva just dripping down. But he had his holster unhooked, and he was ready for you to make a move towards him so he could shoot you.
The American line bulged and broke in places under the fury of the attack, spearheaded by the SS. Battle groups headed for key bridges that must be taken if the plan was to succeed. One of them was commanded by SS Colonel Piper. Traffic jams clogged the few roads, and blown bridges slowed up the advance. Piper pushed ruthlessly ahead, desperate to fill his tanks with American fuel. He had no time for the prisoners he was taking, in increasing numbers. At the crossroads at Vernier, an American column surrendered to Piper. They were gathered up in a nearby field. Suddenly, a tank stopped, and a shot rang out.
I fell, forward, and, I guess everyone, from what I gathered, everyone did hit the ground and play dead. And then guys were moaning, and the ones that they had stationed here at the crossroads, they came around and shot them.
In this field, it was a macabre scene, as GIs were mown down by SS soldiers on a killing spree, shooting everything in sight. When they heard a moan, a shot would ring out. Some lay still, feigning death.
After we were laying there for a little while, we were all praying, I think, out loud. You could hear guys praying. And not many atheists, I don't think. And then someone said, "Let's go." I don't know who that was. And got up and I ran. One of the Germans came out of the house, took a couple shots at me. There was a hole in the hedgerow, pretty good size hole. I dived for it, went in it, and he came up, looked at me, and I had some blood on me, so I guess he thought he hit me or I was dead.
Other Americans escaped to this cafe. The German response was brutal. They set fire to the cafe and shot them as they emerged from the flames. 17 survived to reach the American lines. The official number shot was 86. The SS continued to shoot American prisoners of war and civilians as they advanced. Many of these atrocities were committed by the 1st SS Panzer Division, who 4 years earlier had massacred British prisoners of war at Dunkirk. As the Germans raced to take the key road junctions at Bastogne and Saint-Vith, the only 2 American divisions in reserve were loaded into trucks and rushed to the scene. The 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, veterans of Normandy and Holland, headed for Bastogne. No sooner had they arrived, the Germans cut the highway and surrounded the area.
We were without lots of our winter equipment, in many cases even without ammunition and weapons. Our men were actually picking up helmets and weapons as they marched out to meet the Germans. So, I mean, there was no, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that this was a very tough situation and it was going to take the best we had.
Cut off for the 101st was 60 tanks of 10th Armoured Division, as well as artillery units grabbed as they passed through. They formed a wagon circle round the town. Against this, the Germans launched as many as 15 divisions with tanks and heavy artillery.
All you had to fight them with was a Hail Mary. That's all you had to fight them with, was a Hail Mary. You had nothing else available at the time of the battle. In the initial stages, you had no help whatsoever. You thought you were fighting the whole German army by yourself.
The fighting was furious and costly. One battalion lost a third of its men. But most important, it held up the German advance while the defense of Bastogne was consolidated. But the GIs were going to have to buy time for a lot longer to allow the battered American army to pick itself off the floor and defeat Hitler's all-out offensive to decide whether Germany should live or die.
Julian, why such brutality? Why did the Germans massacre so many of the American prisoners?
Well, it's the SS, and they'd been fighting in Russia, many of them, where killing prisoners was routine. And also, there's absolutely no excuse, of course, they were in a tremendous hurry to get on, but they treated prisoners as dispensable when it suited them.
It seems clear that the Allies were caught by surprise. Why?
Well, they didn't believe that the Germans would attack through this country, which was very bad for armour. And they may have forgotten that the Germans had actually attacked through there 4 years before to
heavily
defeat
wooded
France.
and very muddy.
Heavily wooded, very few roads, rivers, not tank country at all. But the German deception plan was absolutely brilliant.
But there was some warning, wasn't there, if they'd listened?
Well, the chief of intelligence at Eisenhower's headquarters made himself extremely unpopular by saying the Germans may attack here. The response was to send him on leave because they thought he was overwrought.
Was there a major disagreement between the Allied leaders?
Well, there was between Montgomery, who's the British general, and Eisenhower, the supreme commander. Monty wanted to attack with all his force, and the Americans as well, in the north, in a huge, massive 40-divisional attack. Eisenhower said, no, what we'll do is attack all along the front. And what then ended up was a thin line of troops along this very long front, and thinnest of all in the Ardennes.
And of course Eisenhower was in charge, wasn't he?
Eisenhower was in charge, Monty had to do what he was told.
Was Monty very confident at this stage?
Yes, he was. As soon as he realized this attack was coming, he put out British outposts along the River Meuse to give him warning if the Germans were coming his way. He massed his army ready to receive them, and then sent a very cocky signal to Churchill saying we won't be able to withdraw through Dunkirk this time because the Germans hold the place.
Julian, thank you very much indeed. Well, tomorrow you can see part 2 of Julian's film on the Battle of the Bulge, which features one of the epic defences of the Second World War.
4 days before Christmas, it snowed in the Ardennes. The temperature fell below freezing. The men in the Bastogne perimeter were colder than they'd ever been in their lives. And in the foxholes, men wrapped their bodies in blankets. The attacks kept coming.
People died, they froze to death. Whether they were sitting, standing, kneeling, they were just frozen figures. That's it, standing, kneeling, flat, whatever. It's unbelievable. In fact, I think a few guys couldn't get stuff to put on top of their foxhole. They put the few German dead on the top of their foxhole, so shrapnel wouldn't come down on them.
In an attempt to gain the town, the Germans sent an emissary in to Brigadier General McAuliffe, who had his headquarters here in this cellar. They demanded an honorable surrender to save the encircled American troops from certain annihilation.
Tony McAuliffe said, us surrender? Oh, nuts, which was the thing he frequently said. And then he said, well, I wonder if we ought to answer them. We all said, yeah, we should answer them. Should it be in writing? Yes, since they wrote us. And then Tony McAuliffe said, well, I don't know what to tell them. And being a smart aleck 29-year-old colonel, I said, what you first said would be hard to beat. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, you said nuts.
On Christmas Eve, the men received General McAuliffe's Christmas greetings. What's merry about all this, you ask? But he went on to tell them that they had stopped cold everything that had been thrown at them from the north, east, south, and west.
He was hollering, I'm hit, somebody help me. And I went out to help Joe, and I tried to get him into a foxhole, get him covered over, and that's when I got my leg blown off over there. And Joe Toy, I think he had 4 or 5 Purple Hearts. And I think at that time he said, Joe Toy said, what the hell have I got to do to get to die?
Acting on Hitler's orders, a special unit of English speakers in American uniforms and civilian clothes set out to create the maximum confusion within the American army.
He came pedaling down the street on his bicycle, and he was dressed in a black robe with his flat hat, you know. So I just thought I better check him because it didn't look right. And so I stopped him, and he offered no resistance at all. And I asked him for his identification papers. And he handed me his papers, and then I noticed the swastika.
500,000 men played cat and mouse with each other every time they met on the road. Almost no GI or civilian was above suspicion after military police found American impersonators behind their lines.
If there were Germans in American uniforms, the best way to find out if they were German was to open their uniform and see what kind of underwear they had on. Because they wore everything, but they wore the German underwear.
For the first week, bad weather had prevented Allied air forces supporting the soldiers. Then it lifted. By now, the Americans had moved forces in to squeeze out the shoulders of the Bulge. General Patton's troops slugged their way towards Bastogne. The day after Christmas, the siege was lifted.
The lead elements, it was a cavalry charge. The Germans fought hard. But we were able, through superior maneuver and firepower, and guts, I think, to take them on.
The German advance spluttered out before it reached the River Meuse. Vehicles stranded for lack of fuel were sitting ducks for Allied aircraft and guns. British formations were pitched in, and a British parachute battalion was advancing along this road to Bastogne towards the small village of Band in the wake of the retreating SS.
A priest came up the hill in a dreadful state and said, are you German? Are you French? Are you American? But are you German? We said, no, we're not German, we're British. He said, thank God, will you come down with me?
The SS had rounded up Belgian young men and taken them one by one across the road to this door, where, out of sight, their SS executioner awaited them. As each man stepped through the door, his arms were pinned to his side, he was shot in the back of the neck and kicked into the cellar. 34 men were executed in this way.
It was a grisly sight. Some of the bodies were green. They'd been there for, what, over a week, 10 days. And as each one was brought up, there was a dreadful cry and moan from principally the women as they were recognized. Most of them had their hands clenched, as if they were anticipating the shot in the back of their necks.
Brutalities like this, once the word got around, served to stiffen Allied resolve to defeat the regime that had produced such horrors. It was that resolve and the fighting qualities of the American soldier that saved the day.
The man next to you, regardless of who he was, you winked at him, he said, buddy, I won't let you down. Buddy, I won't let you down. And that went through you, and it just passed all along to the men that were there, every one of them. They knew each other. They would not let each other down.
This monument at Bastogne is a symbol of the fierce resistance of American fighting men holding firm in the rolling tide of one of the worst military disasters in modern American history.
Extraordinary story. Julian, why was it that the Americans held on at Bastogne while everywhere else their army was collapsing?
Well, at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was one of the finest divisions in the Allied forces, and they were used to fighting behind enemy lines. They'd done it a lot, whereas many American formations hadn't been trained to defend, just attack.
The battle as a whole, was this the end for Hitler?
Well, it really marked the beginning of the end, because he threw away two of his best armies trying to win this battle, and they weren't available then to fight the Allies for the rest of the war.
And where did it leave relations between the Allies?
Well, it brought to a head the Monty-Eisenhower argument, and Monty made it far worse by holding a press conference after the battle and paying tribute to the Americans rightly, but then adding, in his rather conceited way, it was an interesting little battle. What a thing to say.
That must have infuriated the Americans.
Well, it did, because it rubbed Eisenhower's nose in it.
Well, in terms of casualties, this was a very bloody battle, wasn't it?
Well, it was indeed, and the Americans had over 80,000 casualties, which was something like 10 times the casualties for D-Day.
And in another sort of odd side effect, it marked the end of segregation in the American army. How did that come about?
Well, what happened was that blacks in the American army had positions in administrative units in the rear, and the Americans were so short of men after this battle, they brought forward blacks into fighting units, and it marked the end, as you say, of segregation in the United States forces.
And the Germans, in fact, used that for propaganda reasons, didn't they?
Yes, they did, in a very unpleasant racial way.
Julian, fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for that. Sally.